The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, fought during 25 to 27 October 1942, sometimes referred to as the Battle of Santa Cruz or in Japanese sources as the Battle of the South Pacific, was the fourth carrier battle of the Pacific Campaign of World War II and the fourth major naval engagement fought between the United States Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy during the lengthy and strategically important Guadalcanal Campaign. In similar fashion to the battles of Coral Sea, Midway, and the Eastern Solomons, the ships of the two adversaries were rarely in direct visual range of each other. Instead, almost all attacks by both sides were mounted by carrier or land-based aircraft, in an attempt to drive Allied forces from Guadalcanal and nearby islands and end the stalemate that had existed since September 1942. The Imperial Japanese Army planned a major ground offensive on Guadalcanal for 20 to 25 October 1942. In support of this offensive, and with the hope of engaging Allied naval forces, Japanese carriers and other large warships moved into a position near the southern Solomon Islands. From this location, the Japanese naval forces hoped to engage and decisively defeat any Allied naval forces, especially carrier forces, that responded to the ground offensive. Allied naval forces also hoped to meet the Japanese naval forces in battle, with the same objectives of breaking the stalemate and decisively defeating their adversary. The Japanese ground offensive on Guadalcanal was underway in the battle for Henderson Field while the naval warships and aircraft from the two adversaries confronted each other on the morning of the 26th of October 1942, just north of the Santa Cruz Islands. After an exchange of carrier air attacks, Allied surface ships were forced to retreat from the battle area with one carrier sunk and another heavily damaged. Although a tactical victory for the Japanese in terms of ships sunk and damaged, the loss of many irreplaceable veteran aircrews would prove to be a long-term strategic advantage for the Allies, whose aircrew losses in the battle were relatively low and could be quickly replaced. The high casualties for the Japanese prevented their carrier forces from further significant involvement in the battle for Guadalcanal, contributing to the eventual Allied victory in that campaign. Background: on 7 August 1942, Allied forces landed on Japanese-occupied Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and Florida Islands in the Solomon Islands. The landings on the islands were meant to deny their use by the Japanese as bases for threatening the supply routes between the US and Australia, and to secure the islands as starting points for a campaign with the eventual goal of neutralizing the major Japanese base at Rabaul while also supporting the Allied New Guinea campaign. The landings initiated the 6-month-long Guadalcanal campaign. After the Battle of the Eastern Solomons from 24–25 August, in which the aircraft carrier US Enterprise was heavily damaged and forced to travel to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, for a month of major repairs, 3 U.S. carrier task forces remained in the South Pacific area. The task forces included the carriers US Wasp, Saratoga, and Hornet plus their respective air groups and supporting surface warships, including battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, and were primarily stationed between the Solomons and New Hebrides Islands. At this location, the carriers were charged with guarding the line of communication between the major Allied bases at New Caledonia and Espiritu Santo, supporting the Allied ground forces at Guadalcanal and Tulagi against any Japanese counter-offensives, covering the movement of supply ships to Guadalcanal, and engaging and destroying any Japanese warships, especially carriers, that came within range. The area of ocean in which the U.S. carrier task forces operated was known as Torpedo Junction by U.S. forces because of the high concentration of Japanese submarines in the area. On 31 August, US Saratoga was torpedoed by Japanese submarine I-26 and was out of action for 3 months for repairs. On 14 September, Wasp was hit by 3 torpedoes fired by Japanese submarine I-19 while supporting a major reinforcement and resupply convoy to Guadalcanal, almost engaging 2 Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. With power knocked out from torpedo damage, Wasp's damage control teams were unable to contain the ensuing large fires, and she was abandoned and scuttled. Although the U.S. now had only one operational carrier in the South Pacific, the Allies still maintained air superiority over the southern Solomon Islands because of their aircraft based at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. However, at night, when aircraft were not able to operate effectively, the Japanese were able to operate their ships around Guadalcanal almost at will. Thus, a stalemate in the battle for Guadalcanal developed, with the Allies delivering supplies and reinforcements to Guadalcanal during the day, and the Japanese doing the same by warship at night, with neither side able to deliver enough troops to the island to secure a decisive advantage. By mid-October, both sides had roughly an equal number of troops on the island. The stalemate was briefly interrupted by 2 large ship naval actions. On the night of 11–12 October, a U.S. naval force intercepted and defeated a Japanese naval force en route to bombard Henderson Field in the Battle of Cape Esperance. But just 2 nights later, a Japanese force that included the battleships Haruna and Congo successfully bombarded Henderson Field, destroying most of the U.S. aircraft and inflicting severe damage on the field's facilities. Although still marginally operational, it took several weeks for the airfield to recover from the damage and replace the destroyed aircraft. At this time, the U.S. made 2 moves to try to break the stalemate in the battle for Guadalcanal. First, repairs to Enterprise were expedited so that she could return to the South Pacific as soon as possible. On the 10th of October, Enterprise received her new air groups. On the 16th of October, she left Pearl Harbor, and on the 23rd of October, she arrived back in the South Pacific and rendezvoused with Hornet and the rest of the Allied South Pacific Naval Forces on the 24th of October. 273 nmi northeast of Espiritu Santo. Second, on the 18th of October, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Allied Commander-in-Chief of Pacific Forces, replaced Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley with Vice Admiral William Halsey, Jr. as Commander, South Pacific Area. This position commanded Allied forces involved in the Solomon Islands campaign. Nimitz felt that Gormley had become too myopic and pessimistic to lead Allied forces effectively in the struggle for Guadalcanal. Halsey was reportedly respected throughout the U.S. naval fleet as a fighter. Upon assuming command, Halsey immediately began making plans to draw the Japanese naval forces into a battle. Writing to Nimitz, "I had to begin throwing punches almost immediately." The Japanese combined fleet was also seeking to draw Allied naval forces into what was hoped to be a decisive battle. 2 fleet carriers, Haiyo and Junyo, and 1 light carrier, Zuiho, arrived at the main Japanese naval base at Truk Atoll from Japan in early October and joined Shokaku and Zuikaku. With 5 carriers fully equipped with air groups, plus their numerous battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, the Japanese combined fleet, directed by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was confident that it could make up for the defeat at the Battle of Midway. Apart from a couple of air raids on Henderson Field in October, the Japanese carriers and their supporting warships stayed out of the battle for Guadalcanal in the northwestern area of the Solomon Islands, waiting for a chance to approach and engage the U.S. carriers. With the Japanese Army's next planned major ground attack on Allied forces on Guadalcanal set for the 20th of October, Yamamoto's warships began to move towards the southern Solomons to support the offensive and to be ready to engage any Allied ships, especially carriers, that approached to support the Allied defenses on Guadalcanal. Prelude. From 20 to 25 October, Japanese land forces on Guadalcanal attempted to capture Henderson Field with a large-scale attack against U.S. troops defending the airfield. However, the attack was decisively defeated with heavy casualties for the Japanese during the Battle for Henderson Field, incorrectly believing that the Japanese Army troops had succeeded in capturing Henderson Field. A force of Japanese warships approached Guadalcanal on the morning of the 25th of October to provide further support for the Army offensive. Aircraft from Henderson Field attacked the convoy throughout the day, sinking the light cruiser Yura and damaging the destroyer Akizuki. Despite the failure of the Japanese ground offensive and the loss of Yura, the rest of the combined fleet continued to maneuver near the southern Solomon Islands on the 25th of October with the hope of encountering Allied naval forces in battle. The Japanese naval forces now consisted of 4 carriers, because Hayo had suffered an accidental, damaging fire in her engine room on October 22 that forced her to return to Truk for repairs. The Japanese naval forces were divided into 3 groups. The advanced force consisted of the carrier Jumyo, plus 2 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 10 destroyers, and was commanded by Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo in heavy cruiser Vatago. The main body consisted of Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Zuiho plus 1 heavy cruiser and 8 destroyers, and was commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumu aboard Shokaku. The vanguard force contained 2 battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 7 destroyers, and was commanded by Rear Admiral Hiroki Abe in battleship Hiei. In addition to commanding the advanced force, Kondo acted as the overall commander of the 3 forces. The U.S. naval forces were deployed as 2 separate carrier groups. Task Force 16 under command of Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid and built around of Carrier Enterprise, and Task Force 17 under command of Rear Admiral George Murray and built around Carrier Hornet. The 2 groups were under overall command by Kincaid, and were separated from each other by about 10 nmi. The carriers were supported by 1 battleship, 3 heavy cruisers, 3 light anti-aircraft cruisers, and 14 destroyers. A third U.S. task force, Task Force 64, commanded by Rear Admiral Willis Lee, consisted of battleship HUS Washington, heavy cruiser San Francisco, light cruiser Helena, anti-aircraft cruiser Atlanta, and 6 destroyers. This last force, however, had withdrawn to the southeast for fueling, and played no part in the upcoming battle. The 2 U.S. carrier groups swept around to the north of the Santa Cruz Islands on October 25 searching for the Japanese naval forces. A U.S. PBY Catalina based in the Santa Cruz Islands located the Japanese main body carriers at 11:03. However, the Japanese carriers were about 355 nmi from the U.S. force, just beyond carrier aircraft range. Kincaid, hoping to close the range to be able to execute an attack that day, steamed towards the Japanese carriers at top speed and, at 14:25, launched a strike force of 23 aircraft. But the Japanese, knowing that they had been spotted by U.S. aircraft and not knowing where the U.S. carriers were, turned to the north to stay out of range of the U.S. carriers' aircraft. Thus, the U.S. strike force returned to their carriers without finding or attacking the Japanese warships.